Greek fire. Greek fire stands as one of the most unsettling examples of lost scientific knowledge, not because it was mysterious, but because it undeniably worked. For centuries, this substance served as a strategic weapon of the Byzantine Empire, protecting Constantinople from invasions that should have succeeded by every conventional military calculation. Contemporary accounts describe a liquid flame launched from siphons mounted on ships, a burning substance that clung to wood, flesh, and metal, and continued to burn even when it struck the surface of the sea. Water did not extinguish it. In some cases, it seemed to intensify the fire instead. The power of Greek fire was not merely physical. It was psychological. Enemy fleets reportedly broke formation at the mere sight of the weapon being prepared. The sound of the siphons, the roar of the flame, and the unnatural sight of fire spreading across water created panic long before contact was made. Naval warfare in the medieval world depended heavily on boarding and ramming tactics, but Greek fire rendered such strategies useless. Wooden ships became liabilities rather than assets. What makes Greek fire particularly disturbing is the level of technical sophistication it implies. The weapon was not a simple incendiary. It required a stable chemical mixture, a pressurized delivery system, and controlled ignition. This suggests a practical understanding of chemistry, fluid dynamics, and mechanical engineering far beyond what is commonly attributed to the early medieval period. The Byzantines were not merely inheritors of Roman knowledge. They refined it, weaponized it, and guarded it obsessively. The formula for Greek fire was treated as a state secret of the highest order. Production was centralized, and the knowledge was passed down through a tightly controlled chain, often within a single family or imperial workshop. Written records were deliberately vague or misleading. Ingredients were disguised under metaphorical language, and technical descriptions were omitted entirely. This was not an accidental loss of knowledge. It was engineered secrecy. Historical sources suggest the substance may have been based on petroleum derivatives, resins, sulfur compounds, or quicklime, but these are educated guesses rather than confirmed facts. Modern experiments attempting to recreate Greek fire have produced flammable mixtures, but none have fully replicated the behavior described in historical accounts. The defining characteristic remains elusive: a flame that resists water, adheres to surfaces, and burns with terrifying persistence. The disappearance of Greek fire was gradual rather than sudden. As the Byzantine Empire weakened, so did the institutional structures that protected its secrets. Workshops were destroyed, specialists died without successors, and political instability made continuity impossible. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, Greek fire was already gone. No formula was captured. No reliable manual survived. What remained were fragments of description, written by observers who never fully understood what they were seeing. The loss of Greek fire highlights a harsh reality of scientific progress. Knowledge does not move forward in a straight line. It can stagnate, regress, or vanish entirely if the conditions that support it collapse. Greek fire was not lost because it was ineffective or obsolete. It was lost because it was hoarded, isolated, and tied to a single political entity. When that entity fell, the knowledge died with it. Today, Greek fire occupies an uncomfortable space between history and legend. It is well documented, widely referenced, and broadly accepted as real, yet functionally inaccessible. It serves as a reminder that technological superiority is fragile, and that secrecy, while powerful in the short term, can ensure total erasure in the long run. Greek fire was not just a weapon. It was a warning, written in flame, about how easily humanity can lose what it once mastered. The Antikythera Mechanism. The Antikythera Mechanism is one of the most disturbing reminders that scientific progress is not guaranteed to move forward. Discovered in 1901 among the remains of a Roman shipwreck near the Greek island of Antikythera, it initially appeared to be nothing more than a corroded lump of bronze and stone. Only later did researchers realize they were looking at something fundamentally incompatible with the accepted timeline of technological development. This was not a simple tool, decoration, or navigational aid. It was a machine of extraordinary precision, created more than 2,000 years ago. As the fragments were carefully examined, scientists uncovered an intricate system of interlocking bronze gears, cut with mathematical accuracy. At least 30 gears were identified, some arranged in complex differential systems that would not reappear in known engineering until the early modern period. The mechanism was housed in a wooden case and operated by turning a hand crank. This motion drove the gears to calculate and display astronomical information with remarkable sophistication. The Antikythera mechanism was capable of predicting solar and lunar eclipses, tracking the cycles of the moon, and modeling the irregular motion of celestial bodies. It encoded the Metonic cycle, the Saros cycle, and other astronomical periods essential for understanding time, seasons, and eclipses. In practical terms, it functioned as an analog computer, translating abstract mathematical relationships into mechanical motion. No other known device from antiquity comes close to this level of complexity. What makes the Antikythera mechanism particularly unsettling is not just its existence, but its isolation. There are no known predecessors and no known successors. No workshops have been found. No manuals survive. No written descriptions from antiquity clearly explain how such a device was designed, built, or used. Classical texts reference astronomy and mathematics at a high theoretical level, but they are largely silent on the mechanical engineering required to turn those theories into a functioning machine. The craftsmanship suggests a deep understanding of gear ratios, tolerances, and long-term mechanical stability. The gears were not decorative. They were functional, optimized for precise calculations over extended periods of time. Errors accumulated slowly, indicating that the designer anticipated repeated use across decades. This was not an experimental prototype. It was a mature piece of technology. Modern imaging techniques, including X-ray tomography, have revealed inscriptions engraved directly onto the mechanism. These texts act as a form of user interface, explaining what the dials represent and how to interpret their readings. This implies that the device was intended to be operated by someone educated, but not necessarily by its creator. In other words, this knowledge had moved beyond a single mind and into a broader intellectual environment. And yet, that environment vanished. By the time of the Roman Empire, the tradition that produced the Antikythera mechanism had already begun to fade. Political instability, shifting priorities, and the gradual decline of Hellenistic scientific institutions eroded the systems that supported advanced research and precision craftsmanship. Theoretical knowledge survived in texts. Practical knowledge did not. The ability to build machines like this one disappeared without ceremony. The Antikythera mechanism forces an uncomfortable reassessment of ancient science. It suggests that the ancient world may have possessed not just abstract mathematical brilliance, but a practical engineering culture capable of translating theory into machines of real computational power. This capability did not evolve into modern technology. It ended. For centuries, humanity reinvented ideas that had already existed in some form. Complex gearing systems reappeared in medieval clocks, long after the Antikythera mechanism had corroded into silence at the bottom of the sea. When similar levels of mechanical computation finally returned, no memory remained of their ancient predecessor. The mechanism's loss was not caused by a single catastrophe. It was the result of neglect, fragmentation, and the slow breakdown of institutions that preserve and transmit knowledge. Once the craftsman died and the workshops closed, the understanding embedded in metal and motion was gone. Today, the Antikythera mechanism stands as physical evidence that history has gaps deeper than missing texts. It shows that entire technological traditions can vanish so completely that their existence seems impossible until rediscovered by accident. It is not merely an artifact. It is proof that humanity has already reached heights it later forgot, and that progress can be erased just as thoroughly as it can be achieved. Roman concrete. Roman concrete represents one of the most quietly humiliating losses in the history of engineering. Unlike mythical weapons or mysterious devices, its effectiveness is not debated, exaggerated, or symbolic. It is physically present, still standing after nearly 2,000 years. Roman harbors, aqueducts, bridges, and domes continue to exist today, often in better condition than modern concrete structures built less than a century ago. The knowledge behind them was not mysterious in appearance. It was practical, repeatable, and devastatingly durable. And yet, it was lost. At its core, Roman concrete was not simply a mixture of stone and binding material. It was a carefully engineered composite designed to interact with its environment over time. Roman builders used volcanic ash, known today as pozzolana, combined with lime and aggregate. When mixed with seawater, this concrete did something unexpected. Instead of degrading, it slowly grew stronger. Chemical reactions occurred within the material, forming crystalline structures that reinforced it from the inside. Modern concrete, by contrast, is optimized for speed, cost, and short-term performance. Steel reinforcement corrodes. Microcracks spread. Water infiltrates. Entire structures are designed with a finite lifespan in mind. Roman concrete was built with no such expectation of decay. It was not maintenance-free, but it was chemically resilient in ways modern engineers only recently began to understand. The most striking examples are Roman maritime structures. Harbors exposed to constant wave action and saltwater remain intact after centuries of erosion. Underwater analysis has shown that Roman concrete reacts with seawater to form rare minerals that increase structural integrity. This was not accidental. It required empirical knowledge, material selection, and long-term observation. Roman engineers may not have understood the atomic mechanisms, but they understood the results. The loss of Roman concrete was not sudden. It followed the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, when centralized infrastructure, standardized construction practices, and large-scale public works ceased to exist. The knowledge was embedded not in formal scientific texts, but in craft traditions, building practices, and institutional continuity. When those institutions collapsed, the recipes became fragmented. Local builders adapted, simplified, or abandoned the methods entirely. Medieval Europe continued to build, but on a smaller scale and with different priorities. Stone masonry replaced concrete in many regions. Lime-based mortars were used, but the precise balance of materials that made Roman concrete exceptional was no longer consistently applied. Over generations, the subtle techniques disappeared. What remained were ruins that people could see, but not fully understand. For centuries, Roman concrete was treated as a curiosity rather than a technological achievement. The durability of Roman structures was attributed to superstition, lost genius, or exaggerated craftsmanship. Only in the modern era did scientists begin to analyze the material systematically. When they did, the results were unsettling. Roman concrete was not inferior technology awaiting improvement. In specific applications, particularly marine construction, it was superior. The rediscovery of its properties did not immediately lead to widespread adoption. Modern construction is constrained by economics, regulations, and supply chains. Volcanic ash of the exact composition used by the Romans is not universally available. Building codes prioritize predictability over long-term chemical evolution. The Roman approach does not fit neatly into contemporary industrial frameworks. Roman concrete challenges the assumption that technological history is a linear ascent. It demonstrates that optimization can occur in directions modern systems no longer value. Longevity, environmental interaction, and material self-reinforcement were not theoretical goals for Roman engineers. They were observed outcomes refined through practice. The loss of Roman concrete is especially troubling because it was not secret, mystical, or restricted to elites. It was widespread, standardized, and essential to public life. Its disappearance shows how easily practical knowledge can vanish when it is not formally preserved. Written descriptions alone were insufficient. Without the economic and political structures that demanded its use, the knowledge atrophied. Today, Roman concrete stands as silent evidence embedded in ports, walls, and domes. It does not announce itself as a lost miracle. It simply refuses to fail. And in doing so, it exposes a deeply uncomfortable truth. Modern civilization, for all its scientific understanding, once forgot how to build something that the ancient world already knew how to make last. The Silk Road Alchemical Secrets. The Silk Road was never just a network for moving silk, spices, and precious metals. It was a vast, unstable corridor of ideas, techniques, and experimental knowledge stretching across continents. Along this route, alchemical traditions from China, India, the Islamic world, and the Mediterranean interacted in ways that were rarely recorded and never fully standardized. What emerged from this exchange was not a single coherent system, but a fragmented body of practical knowledge that quietly influenced early chemistry, medicine, metallurgy, and material science. Much of it is now irretrievably lost. Alchemists operating along the Silk Road were not isolated mystics. Many were artisans, physicians, metalworkers, and court scholars. Their work was rooted in experimentation rather than abstract theory. They refined ores, purified substances, created alloys, pigments, medicines, and early chemical compounds through repeated trial and error. Results were shared orally, encoded in symbolic language, or restricted to apprentices. Precision existed, but it was rarely written in a form that could survive outside the immediate tradition. One of the defining features of Silk Road alchemy was secrecy. Knowledge was power, and power was dangerous. Techniques that improved metal quality, enhanced pigments, or extended shelf life of substances had military, economic, and political value. As a result, methods were deliberately obscured. Recipes used metaphors instead of measurements. Substances were renamed according to astrological or philosophical symbolism. This made the knowledge transferable only within tightly controlled networks. The cross-cultural nature of the Silk Road intensified this fragmentation. Chinese alchemical traditions emphasize balance, transformation, and internal processes, often tied to Taoist philosophy. Indian practices focused on purification, distillation, and the medicinal properties of minerals and metals. Islamic alchemy introduced systematic experimentation, apparatus design, and early classification of substances. When these traditions met, they influenced one another, but rarely merged into a unified, documented system. Materials traveled more easily than explanations. Substances such as mercury compounds, sulfur mixtures, mineral acids, dyes, and metal alloys spread across regions without the full context of how they were produced. Artisans learned results without always understanding the underlying processes. When supply chains were disrupted or political control shifted, the techniques associated with those materials disappeared. The decline of Silk Road alchemical knowledge was gradual and uneven. Trade routes shifted. Empires rose and fell. Religious and philosophical priorities changed. In some regions, alchemy became associated with superstition or heresy. In others, it was absorbed into early chemistry, stripped of its symbolic language but also of its empirical nuances. What could not be translated into the emerging scientific framework was discarded. Written records that did survive often became incomprehensible. Without direct transmission from teacher to student, symbolic texts lost their meaning. Instructions depended on tacit knowledge. The smell of a reaction, the color at a precise moment, the sound of a vessel under pressure. These details were never fully captured in writing. Once the human chain broke, the knowledge collapsed. The Silk Road's alchemical legacy is visible only in fragments. Certain pigments, glass techniques, and metallurgical practices appear suddenly in archaeological records, then vanish. Later civilizations replicated similar results through independent rediscovery, unaware that comparable techniques had existed centuries earlier. The continuity was broken so completely that repetition replaced inheritance. What makes these lost alchemical secrets particularly unsettling is their practical nature. They were not speculative theories waiting for validation. They were working methods refined through experience, applied to real materials and tested by use. Their disappearance did not occur because they failed. It occurred because the social structures that protected and transmitted them dissolved. The story of Silk Road alchemy reveals a fundamental vulnerability in human knowledge. When information is tied too closely to secrecy, tradition, and informal transmission, it becomes fragile. The Silk Road connected civilizations, but it did not preserve their methods. What remains is not a complete science, but a shadow of one, scattered across cultures that once shared far more than history remembers. Damascus Steel. Damascus Steel occupies a rare position in the history of material science where legend and verified performance overlap. Unlike many lost technologies whose effectiveness is debated, Damascus blades were feared, traded, and documented across centuries. Their reputation was not built on myth alone. These weapons demonstrated mechanical properties that even modern metallurgy struggles to replicate consistently: exceptional sharpness, unusual flexibility, and a distinctive surface pattern that was not decorative, but structural. The steel emerged in the Middle East during the early medieval period, though its origins likely trace back to India. There, high-carbon crucible steel known as woods was produced using tightly controlled heating and cooling processes. This steel was transported as ingots along trade routes and forged by skilled smiths into blades that exhibited both hardness and resilience. The process demanded extreme precision. Slight variations in temperature or composition could ruin the material entirely. What made Damascus steel unique was its internal microstructure. When forged correctly, carbon-rich regions formed within the metal, creating bands of carbide that enhanced cutting ability while preventing brittleness. These structures were invisible to the naked eye but revealed themselves as flowing, watery patterns on the blade's surface after polishing and etching. The pattern was not applied. It emerged naturally from the internal organization of the steel. Contemporary accounts describe blades capable of slicing through armor, severing other swords, or bending under stress without breaking. While some descriptions were undoubtedly exaggerated, modern analysis of surviving specimens confirms that Damascus steel possessed properties well beyond typical medieval alloys. The smiths who produced it had no theoretical framework for metallurgy as understood today, yet their empirical mastery was precise and repeatable. The knowledge required to create Damascus steel was never fully documented. It was transmitted through apprenticeship, guarded by guilds, and constrained by access to specific raw materials. The production of wood steel depended on particular or compositions and crucible techniques. When trade routes shifted and/or sources were depleted or disrupted, the foundation of the process collapsed. By the 18th century, true Damascus steel had vanished. Blades continued to be labeled as such, but they were imitations, lacking the internal structure that defined the original material. European metallurgists attempted to reproduce it, often unsuccessfully. The problem was not a lack of effort, but a lack of contextual knowledge. The original process depended on subtle variables that were never recorded: cooling rates, forge atmospheres, and material impurities that modern purification methods unintentionally remove. The disappearance of Damascus steel was not caused by a single event. It resulted from the erosion of trade networks, the decline of traditional smithing cultures, and the rise of industrial steel production. Mass production favored consistency over excellence. Techniques that required extreme skill and patience became economically irrelevant. As fewer blades were made, fewer masters remained to teach the process. In modern times, scientists have approached Damascus steel with microscopes and spectroscopy rather than forges. They have identified nanoscale structures and complex carbon distributions that explain its performance. Experimental reproductions have achieved partial success, but the results remain inconsistent. What is recreated in laboratories often lacks the reliability of historical blades forged centuries ago. Damascus steel exposes a critical limitation of scientific memory. The material did not disappear because it was ineffective or inferior. It disappeared because it was too dependent on human skill, localized resources, and uninterrupted tradition. Once those conditions failed, the knowledge could not survive in written form alone. Today, Damascus steel endures as both artifact and accusation. It accuses modern society of assuming that analytical understanding automatically surpasses experiential mastery. The blades that remain are silent proof that advanced material science once existed without equations, without microscopes, and without institutions capable of preserving it beyond the lives of those who knew how to make it. The Library of Alexandria. The Library of Alexandria represents one of the most catastrophic losses in the history of human knowledge, not because a single building was destroyed, but because an entire system of intellectual preservation collapsed. Founded in the early 3rd century BCE in Egypt, the library was not merely a collection of scrolls. It was the core of an ambitious project to gather, organize, and expand all known knowledge of the ancient world. Its destruction did not erase one field or one discipline. It erased continuity itself. The library operated as part of a larger institution known as the Mouse Ion, a state-funded research center that attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, engineers, geographers, and philosophers worked side by side. They were provided with housing, stipends, and access to an unparalleled archive of texts. Knowledge was not only stored there, it was actively produced, debated, corrected, and expanded. The collection itself was vast by ancient standards. Estimates vary, but ancient sources suggest hundreds of thousands of scrolls. These included works of philosophy, science, medicine, engineering, mathematics, literature, and technical manuals. Texts were copied meticulously. Ships entering the harbor of Alexandria were searched for books, which were borrowed, copied, and often replaced with replicas while the originals were kept. Accuracy mattered, but completeness mattered more. What made the Library of Alexandria uniquely powerful was its approach to knowledge as a cumulative process. Scholars compared manuscripts, corrected errors, standardized texts, and developed early forms of peer review. Mathematical proofs were refined. Astronomical observations were recorded and compared across generations. Medical knowledge was collected from multiple cultures and evaluated through practice. This institutional memory allowed progress that individual scholars could never achieve alone. Among the figures associated with Alexandria were Euclid, whose work shaped geometry for 2 millennia, Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, and Herophilus, who conducted systematic studies of human anatomy. These were not isolated achievements. They were products of an environment that supported sustained inquiry and preserved results for future refinement. The loss of the library was not a single dramatic event. It occurred through a series of degradations over centuries. Fires, political instability, shifts in religious authority, and the gradual withdrawal of state support all contributed. Each disruption removed part of the structure that sustained the institution. When funding declined, scholars left. When scholars left, copying stopped. When copying stopped, texts decayed. By the time the library finally ceased to function, much of its content had already vanished. Scrolls are fragile. Without constant reproduction, they do not survive. What was lost were not just famous philosophical works, but technical treatises, experimental records, engineering designs, and observational data that had no other copies. Entire lines of inquiry ended without successors. The consequences were profound and long-lasting. Later civilizations inherited fragments rather than systems. Mathematical results survived without their methodological context. Medical knowledge persisted without clinical records. Engineering principles were remembered without detailed instructions. Centuries later, scholars would rediscover ideas that had already been explored, tested, and in some cases refined beyond what was then possible. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria is often framed as an act of violence or fanaticism. This simplifies the reality. The true tragedy lies in neglect, institutional decay, and the failure to prioritize preservation. Knowledge does not vanish only when it is burned. It vanishes when it is no longer maintained. What makes Alexandria especially haunting is not just what was lost, but how much effort had already been invested in protecting it. The library was designed to resist loss through duplication, classification, and institutional support. It failed because those systems depended on political stability and sustained commitment. Once those collapsed, no amount of accumulated wisdom could save itself. The Library of Alexandria stands as a warning embedded in history. Advanced knowledge requires more than brilliant individuals. It requires infrastructure, continuity, and deliberate preservation. Without these, even the greatest concentration of human understanding can dissolve quietly, leaving behind only references to what once existed and no reliable way to recover it. Tesla's death ray, Teleforce. Tesla's so-called death ray, officially referred to by him as Teleforce, occupies a deeply uncomfortable space between documented science, personal ambition, and lost technological possibility. Unlike many speculative weapons attributed to inventors after their deaths, Teleforce was repeatedly described by Nikola Tesla himself during the final decades of his life. He insisted it was not a fantasy, not a theoretical proposal, but a functional defensive system capable of changing the nature of warfare. Yet no working model survives, and no complete technical documentation has ever been recovered. Tesla conceived Teleforce as a means of projecting concentrated energy or matter over vast distances. Contrary to popular imagery, he did not describe it as a beam of light or radiation. Instead, Tesla spoke of streams of microscopic charged particles accelerated to extremely high velocities. These particles, according to his claims, could disable aircraft, melt engines, or create impenetrable defensive barriers along national borders. In his view, Teleforce would make large-scale war obsolete by rendering invasion impossible. What makes these claims difficult to dismiss outright is Tesla's track record. He had already demonstrated wireless power transmission, high-voltage systems, and electromagnetic effects that exceeded the capabilities of his contemporaries. His understanding of resonance, alternating current, and electrical discharge placed him decades ahead of mainstream engineering. Teleforce emerged not from ignorance, but from an extension of principles Tesla had already explored experimentally. Tesla asserted that the core challenge was not energy generation, but control. Accelerating particles required precise regulation of voltage, vacuum conditions, and directional stability. He claimed to have solved these problems using novel electrostatic methods and specialized apparatus designs. However, he deliberately avoided publishing full details. Tesla believed that uncontrolled dissemination would lead to offensive misuse rather than defensive protection. By the 1930s, Tesla was financially isolated and increasingly marginalized by the scientific establishment. His ideas were often dismissed as impractical or delusional, despite his earlier successes. When he offered Teleforce to governments, he framed it as a peacekeeping technology. Reports suggest that several nations showed interest, though no confirmed contracts were finalized. When Tesla died in 1943, his papers were seized by U.S. authorities. Government officials reviewed his documents to assess potential military value. Some materials were later returned to his family, while others were classified, lost, or possibly destroyed. The full inventory of what was examined has never been publicly confirmed. What remains today are fragments, notes, patents unrelated to Teleforce, and second-hand descriptions of missing documents. The absence of a working prototype complicates any evaluation of Teleforce feasibility. Some modern physicists argue that Tesla's concepts violate practical limitations of particle dispersion and energy delivery. Others acknowledge that certain elements resemble technologies developed decades later, such as particle accelerators and directed energy research. Whether Teleforce was achievable with the materials and power sources of Tesla's era remains unresolved. What is certain is that Tesla believed in Teleforce to the end of his life. He continued refining the concept, defending its viability, and expressing frustration that it had not been implemented. This conviction distinguishes Teleforce from casual speculation. It was a serious project pursued by an inventor whose previous impossible ideas had reshaped the world. The story of Tesla's death ray is not simply about a missing weapon. It reflects the vulnerability of unconventional research in systems that prioritize immediate practicality and institutional approval. Tesla worked largely alone, without the industrial support required to preserve and validate complex technology. When he died, the knowledge existed only in his mind and scattered papers. Teleforce remains unresolved not because it was conclusively disproven, but because the chain of development was broken. Whether it was a viable technology, an incomplete experiment, or an overextension of genius, its disappearance reinforces a central theme of lost science. Innovation without preservation leaves no inheritance. Tesla's death ray stands as a reminder that even in the modern age, knowledge can vanish silently, leaving behind only controversy, speculation, and the uncomfortable possibility of what might have been. The Maya blue pigment. The Maya blue pigment represents one of the most precise and quietly sophisticated material technologies developed in the ancient world. Unlike gold, stone monuments, or astronomical structures, its importance lies in chemistry rather than spectacle. Created by the Maya civilization more than 1,000 years ago, this pigment displayed a stability and resilience that defied environmental conditions which destroy most organic dyes. Even after centuries of exposure to humidity, sunlight, and tropical heat, Maya blue retained its color with minimal degradation. The pigment was used extensively in murals, ceramics, sculptures, and ritual objects. Its distinctive turquoise blue tone became a visual signature of Maya culture. Yet what made it extraordinary was not its appearance, but its chemical behavior. Unlike typical pigments derived from minerals or plants alone, Maya blue was a hybrid material combining organic and inorganic components into a stable molecular structure. For centuries, the method of producing Maya blue was completely unknown. The pigment resisted acids, alkalis, and biological decay. Attempts to recreate it using known mineral or botanical dyes consistently failed. This resistance was especially puzzling because one of its components, indigo, is highly vulnerable to environmental degradation when used alone. In Maya blue, indigo became nearly indestructible. Modern analysis eventually revealed that the pigment was created by bonding indigo dye to a specific type of clay mineral, known today as palygorskite. Through controlled heating, the organic molecules became trapped within the microscopic channels of the clay. This process locked the dye in place, shielding it from chemical attack and environmental breakdown. The result was a composite material with properties that neither component possessed on its own. What remains lost is not the general concept, but the precise method. The temperature range required to produce Maya blue is narrow. Too little heat, and the pigment remains unstable. Too much, and the organic component is destroyed. The Maya achieved this balance without modern thermometers or analytical tools. Their control relied on experience, observation, and procedural knowledge passed down through generations. The cultural context of Maya blue further complicates its reconstruction. Evidence suggests the pigment was not merely an artistic material, but a ritual substance. It was used in religious ceremonies, including offerings and sacrificial rites. This implies that its production may have been restricted to specific groups, possibly priests or specialized artisans, rather than widespread craft communities. When Maya civilization declined, the chain of transmission broke. Workshops disappeared. Ritual practices changed or were abandoned. The knowledge was never written in a technical form that could survive cultural collapse. Spanish colonial records mention the pigment's presence, but not its preparation. By the time scientific curiosity turned toward understanding Maya blue, the living tradition was already gone. Although modern laboratories can reproduce materials chemically similar to Maya blue, these reconstructions rely on contemporary analytical techniques rather than inherited knowledge. They confirm what the pigment is, but not how ancient artisans discovered and refined the process. The path from experimentation to mastery remains obscured. Maya blue challenges assumptions about ancient material science. It demonstrates that highly advanced chemical engineering can emerge from empirical practice alone, without formal theory. The pigment's longevity is not an accident. It reflects deliberate design, careful control, and long-term testing. The loss of Maya blue's original production method underscores a recurring pattern in the history of science. When knowledge is embedded in ritual, craftsmanship, and oral tradition, it becomes extraordinarily effective and extraordinarily fragile. Once the social structures that sustain it collapse, the technique disappears, leaving behind results that modern science can analyze, but not fully inherit. The Voynich Manuscript. The Voynich Manuscript is one of the most persistent and unsettling artifacts in the history of lost knowledge, not because its contents are known to be profound, but because they remain completely inaccessible. Discovered in 1912 by rare book dealer Wilfred Voynich, the manuscript has defied every serious attempt at interpretation for more than a century. It is not a fragment, not damaged beyond recognition, and not written in an unknown script without structure. It is a complete book, carefully composed, illustrated, and preserved, yet functionally unreadable. Radiocarbon dating places the manuscript's creation in the early 15th century. The parchment, ink, and binding materials are consistent with that period. The text flows smoothly across hundreds of pages, written in a consistent script with repeating patterns, word frequencies, and grammatical-like structures. Statistical analysis shows that the text behaves like a real language rather than random symbols. And yet, no one has been able to decode it. The manuscript is filled with illustrations that appear simultaneously familiar and alien. Botanical drawings depict plants that do not correspond cleanly to any known species. Astronomical diagrams show stars, suns, and circular arrangements suggestive of calendars or cosmological models. Other sections depict nude human figures interacting with complex systems of tubes, baths, and flowing liquids. These images imply medical, alchemical, or biological content, but without readable text, interpretation remains speculative. What makes the Voynich Manuscript particularly disturbing is its coherence. This is not a chaotic or impulsive creation. The handwriting is consistent, with no visible corrections or hesitation. The layout follows an internal logic. Sections are clearly divided, suggesting an organized body of knowledge. The illustrations align with the text in a way that implies explanation rather than decoration. Whoever created it knew exactly what they were writing. Over the decades, some of the most skilled cryptographers in history have examined the manuscript. Codebreakers from World War I and World War II, including individuals who successfully deciphered military ciphers, failed to make progress. Modern computational analysis has revealed linguistic patterns, but no confirmed translation. Attempts to link the script to known languages, invented alphabets, or cipher systems have all fallen short. The possibility that the manuscript is a hoax is often raised, but it fails to fully explain its properties. Creating a meaningless text with such consistent statistical structure would require a level of sophistication and effort unmatched by known medieval forgeries. Moreover, the cost of materials alone would have been substantial. The manuscript shows no clear motive for deception, and no obvious audience that would benefit from such an elaborate fabrication. Another possibility is that the manuscript encodes knowledge that was deliberately obscured. The use of an invented script could have served to protect sensitive information related to medicine, alchemy, or natural philosophy. In an era where certain ideas could be dangerous, obscurity was a form of security. If this is the case, the manuscript's failure lies not in its encryption, but in the loss of the community that understood it. The tragedy of the Voynich manuscript is not that it resists interpretation, but that it appears complete. Whatever system it represents is fully formed. The loss occurred not during its creation, but afterward. The manuscript survived. The key did not. Unlike burned libraries or destroyed workshops, the Voynich manuscript demonstrates a more subtle failure of preservation. The physical object endured, but the intellectual context vanished. Without that context, the text becomes noise, regardless of its original clarity. The manuscript remains housed in a modern archive, studied with increasingly advanced tools. Yet each new analysis reinforces the same conclusion. Meaning requires continuity. Symbols alone are not enough. The Voynich manuscript stands as a silent book, not because it has nothing to say, but because the world that could hear it no longer exists. The Starlite Material. Starlite is one of the most uncomfortable examples of modern lost scientific knowledge because it existed in full view of contemporary science and still managed to disappear. Unlike ancient technologies erased by centuries of decay, Starlite was developed in the late 20th century, demonstrated on television, tested in controlled environments, and witnessed by professional scientists. This disappearance cannot be blamed on time. It can only be attributed to human decisions, institutional failure, and the fragility of privately held knowledge. The material was invented by Maurice Ward, a British hairdresser with no formal scientific education. Despite this, Ward claimed to have developed a polymer-based substance capable of withstanding extreme temperatures far beyond the limits of conventional materials. In demonstrations during the 1980s and 1990s, Starlite was exposed to blowtorches reaching temperatures high enough to melt steel. The material did not burn, deform, or transfer heat. In some tests, a raw egg placed behind a thin layer of Starlite remained uncooked. These demonstrations attracted significant attention. Aerospace engineers, military researchers, and industrial scientists expressed interest. Fire-resistant materials were, and remain, critically important for aviation, space exploration, nuclear safety, and construction. If Starlite performed as claimed, it represented not an incremental improvement, but a fundamental shift in thermal protection technology. What made Starlite particularly troubling was its apparent simplicity. Ward insisted the material was made from common components, processed in a specific way. He refused to disclose the formula publicly, fearing theft and exploitation. Instead, he attempted to negotiate licensing agreements that would allow controlled use while protecting his intellectual property. This decision proved fatal to the material's survival. Ward lacked the legal, financial, and institutional support required to secure patents across jurisdictions while maintaining secrecy. Potential partners demanded full disclosure. Ward refused. As negotiations stalled, trust eroded. The material remained trapped between private ownership and public validation. After Ward's death in 2011, no complete formula was found among his papers. Partial notes existed, but they were insufficient to recreate the material. Ward's family attempted to continue development but failed to achieve consistent results. If the full process existed, it was either never written down or deliberately obscured. Skepticism toward Starlite has grown in the absence of reproducible samples. Some scientists argue that the demonstrations were misleading or exaggerated. Others point out that multiple independent observers confirmed the material's extraordinary properties. Without the formula, the debate cannot be resolved. Starlite's loss highlights a critical vulnerability in modern innovation. Scientific knowledge increasingly depends on institutional frameworks for validation, preservation, and transmission. When discovery occurs outside those frameworks, it becomes precarious. Ward's lack of formal credentials did not invalidate his work, but it isolated it. The material's disappearance was not the result of suppression or conspiracy, but of incompatibility. A private inventor with a revolutionary material faced systems designed for incremental, transparent development. Neither side adapted. Starlite stands as a modern parallel to ancient lost technologies. It demonstrates that even in an age of digital storage and global communication, knowledge can vanish if it remains locked inside individuals rather than institutions. Its story is not about whether the material truly worked. It is about how easily something that might have changed multiple industries can be lost when trust, documentation, and continuity fail. Archimedes Heat Ray. Archimedes Heat Ray occupies a unique position among lost scientific discoveries because it exists at the boundary between historical record and experimental uncertainty. Unlike purely mythical inventions, the concept is rooted in accounts written by ancient historians who treated Archimedes not as a magician, but as a serious engineer and mathematician. The device was allegedly developed during the siege of Syracuse in the 3rd century BCE, when Roman forces attempted to capture the city. According to these accounts, Archimedes designed a system capable of setting enemy ships on fire using reflected sunlight. The basic description is deceptively simple. A series of polished bronze or copper mirrors were arranged to focus sunlight onto Roman ships approaching the harbor. When aligned correctly, the reflected rays concentrated heat onto a single point, igniting wooden hulls and sails. The result was chaos among the attackers, who reportedly could not understand how their ships were burning without visible flames or projectiles. What makes this account unsettling is that it aligns with what is known about Archimedes' capabilities. He was not a speculative philosopher. He was a practical engineer who designed war machines, cranes, catapults, and defensive mechanisms that demonstrably worked. Roman sources describe Syracuse as nearly impregnable due to Archimedes' inventions. The heat ray was described as one tool among many, not as an isolated miracle. The scientific principle behind the heat ray is sound. Concentrated solar energy can generate intense heat. Modern solar furnaces achieve extremely high temperatures using reflective surfaces. The question is not whether focused sunlight can ignite wood, but whether it could be done under battlefield conditions using ancient materials, with moving targets, variable weather, and limited time. This uncertainty has fueled centuries of debate. Some historians dismissed the heat ray as legend, added later to embellish Archimedes' reputation. Others argued that ancient writers had no incentive to invent such a specific mechanism if it had not existed in some form. The consistency of the descriptions across multiple sources suggests that something unusual occurred, even if the details were imperfectly understood. Modern experiments have produced mixed results. Controlled tests using polished mirrors have successfully ignited stationary wooden targets at short distances. However, replicating these results against moving objects at sea under realistic conditions has proven difficult. These experiments neither conclusively confirm nor disprove the heat ray. They instead highlight how dependent the device would have been on precise coordination, timing, and environmental conditions. What is often overlooked is that the heat ray may not have been intended as a primary weapon. It may have been situational, used selectively to create confusion, fear, or disruption rather than mass destruction. Even brief ignition of sails or rigging could render ships uncontrollable. In a naval engagement, psychological impact could be as decisive as physical damage. The loss of the heat ray's design was likely inevitable. Archimedes left few writings on his mechanical inventions, focusing instead on mathematics and geometry. His war machines were built for immediate necessity, not long-term preservation. When Syracuse fell, Roman soldiers reportedly killed Archimedes despite orders to spare him. His workshop, tools, and devices were destroyed or dismantled. No technical manuals survived. Unlike the Antikythera Mechanism, which was preserved by accident, the heat ray left no physical remnants. It existed only as applied knowledge, dependent on expertise, materials, and circumstance. Once the siege ended and the engineer died, the technology had no reason to persist. It was not standardized, commercialized, or institutionalized. The story of Archimedes' heat ray illustrates a recurring vulnerability in scientific history. Knowledge tied to individual genius and immediate application is fragile. Without documentation, replication, and transmission, even functional technologies can vanish completely. Whether the heat ray was a refined weapon or a clever exploitation of rare conditions, its disappearance leaves an unresolved gap between what ancient engineers may have achieved and what later generations assumed possible. Today, the heat ray remains controversial not because it violates physical laws, but because it challenges assumptions about ancient technological limits. It suggests that under the right circumstances, ancient scientists could manipulate natural forces with a sophistication that modern narratives often underestimate. Its loss is not merely the loss of a weapon, but the loss of an experimental mindset that treated geometry, light, and engineering as integrated tools rather than separate disciplines. Archimedes' heat ray endures as a reminder that scientific capability is not solely defined by tools or materials, but by understanding and intent. When those are lost, even the most elegant applications of natural law can fade into legend, leaving behind only debate and the uncomfortable possibility that something real once burned brightly, then disappeared without trace. The crown of Aragon mechanical knowledge. The mechanical knowledge associated with the crown of Aragon represents one of the least discussed yet most revealing losses in European technological history. Unlike singular inventions or famous devices, this loss concerns an entire tradition of applied engineering that once flourished across the Western Mediterranean during the late Middle Ages. Centered in regions such as Catalonia, Valencia, and parts of southern Italy, the Crown of Aragon maintained a network of shipyards, workshops, and artisan guilds whose mechanical expertise quietly supported trade, warfare, and urban infrastructure. Aragonese engineers and craftsmen developed advanced mechanical systems for shipbuilding, harbor construction, water management, and siege technology. Their ships were known for durability and maneuverability, relying on refined hull designs, complex rigging systems, and carefully balanced weight distribution. These were not intuitive achievements. They reflected generations of accumulated mechanical insight, transmitted through apprenticeship rather than formal academic instruction. One of the defining characteristics of this mechanical tradition was its practical orientation. Designs were rarely preserved as abstract diagrams. Instead, knowledge lived in templates, jigs, proportions, and procedures learned by doing. Measurements were often relative rather than numerical, adapted to available materials and local conditions. This made the techniques flexible but also dangerously fragile. Without continuous practice, the knowledge could not survive. The crown of Aragon benefited from its position at the crossroads of Mediterranean trade. Islamic engineering traditions, Byzantine techniques, and Western European practices converged in its territories. This exchange produced hybrid solutions that were efficient, innovative, and locally optimized. Water-lifting devices, milling mechanisms, and port infrastructure reflected this synthesis, blending mechanical reliability with economic necessity. The decline of this mechanical knowledge did not occur because it was ineffective. It occurred because the social systems that sustained it unraveled. Political unification under larger monarchies shifted economic priorities. Centralization reduced the autonomy of local guilds. Shipyards were reorganized or closed. Skilled artisans were displaced or absorbed into systems that valued standardized output over specialized mastery. Unlike written scientific traditions, mechanical knowledge resists preservation through text alone. Manuals, when they existed, were incomplete. They assumed familiarity with tools, materials, and tacit techniques. When workshops closed and apprenticeships ended, the embodied understanding vanished. What survived were objects without instructions. The transition to early modern engineering further accelerated the loss. Mathematical formalism replaced craft-based reasoning. Standard units replaced proportional systems. While this transition enabled large-scale industrialization, it also erased methods that did not translate cleanly into equations. Techniques optimized for specific environments were abandoned in favor of generalized models. By the time historians began examining medieval engineering seriously, much of the Aragonese mechanical tradition had already dissolved. Ports had been rebuilt, ships redesigned, water systems replaced. The continuity needed to trace technological evolution was gone. Only scattered references and archaeological remnants hinted at what once existed. The loss of the crown of Aragon's mechanical knowledge demonstrates that innovation does not always announce itself through famous names or iconic inventions. It often exists as quiet competence, embedded in systems that function so well they attract little attention. When such systems disappear, the loss is not dramatic but profound. This forgotten mechanical tradition reveals a fundamental truth about technological history. Progress depends not only on discovery, but on maintenance. When the structures that transmit skill, experience, and context collapse, knowledge dissolves even if its results once shaped entire economies. The crown of Aragon did not lose a machine. It lost a way of building. The lost cures of ancient medicine. The lost cures of ancient medicine represent one of the most consequential gaps in scientific history, not because ancient physicians possessed complete understanding of the human body, but because many of their treatments demonstrably worked. Across civilizations in Egypt, Greece, Rome, India, China, and the Middle East, medical practitioners developed remedies through systematic observation, experimentation, and long-term application. These treatments were not theoretical. They were tested on real patients over generations. Yet many of them disappeared before their mechanisms could be understood or preserved. Ancient medicine was fundamentally empirical. Physicians observed symptoms, tracked outcomes, adjusted dosages, and refined treatments through repeated use. While explanations were often framed in spiritual or philosophical language, the practices themselves were practical. Herbal compounds, mineral preparations, dietary interventions, and surgical techniques were evaluated by their effectiveness, not their theoretical elegance. Written medical texts from antiquity suggest a breadth of therapeutic knowledge far exceeding what survived into later periods. Some treatments addressed pain management, infection control, wound healing, and chronic conditions with surprising sophistication. Archaeological evidence supports this. Skeletal remains show signs of successful surgeries. Dental procedures were performed with precision. Fractures were set in ways that promoted proper healing. One of the most troubling aspects of these lost cures is that some appear to have anticipated modern medical discoveries. Certain plant-based remedies exhibit antibacterial or anti-inflammatory properties now recognized by pharmacology. Ancient anesthetic mixtures, combining alcohols, opiates, and herbal extracts, were used to dull pain during surgery. These practices were not crude approximations. They were carefully calibrated responses to observed physiological effects. The disappearance of this knowledge was not driven by scientific failure. It was driven by disruption. Empires fell. Trade routes collapsed. Languages died. Medical schools closed. Knowledge that depended on apprenticeship and oral transmission proved especially vulnerable. When experienced practitioners died without successors, entire therapeutic systems vanished. The transition to medieval medicine further complicated preservation. Religious and cultural shifts reframed illness and healing. In some regions, experimental practices were discouraged or restricted. Theoretical frameworks replaced empirical evaluation. Treatments that lacked alignment with dominant doctrines were abandoned, regardless of their effectiveness. Even when ancient texts survived, they often did so incompletely. Copying errors accumulated. Terminology changed. Ingredients became unidentifiable as plant species evolved or disappeared. Dosage instructions lost context. Without continuous practice, written descriptions became insufficient to recreate treatments accurately. Modern science has occasionally rediscovered fragments of this lost medical knowledge. Analysis of ancient remedies has revealed compounds with measurable therapeutic value. However, these rediscoveries occur in isolation. They reconstruct outcomes without inheriting the full clinical framework that once guided their use. The loss of ancient medical cures is particularly unsettling because it directly affected human well-being. Unlike lost machines or materials, these cures addressed suffering, pain, and survival. Their disappearance represents not just an intellectual loss, but a human one. Ancient medicine demonstrates that effective healthcare does not require complete theoretical understanding. It requires careful observation, consistency, and refinement. When those processes are interrupted, knowledge dissolves regardless of its practical value. The lost cures of ancient medicine stand as a reminder that progress in healthcare is not guaranteed. It can regress, fragment, and forget. Modern medicine continues to advance, but it does so without full awareness of what was once known. Some solutions may not lie ahead, but behind, buried in traditions that worked long before science learned how to explain why. The Baghdad Battery. The Baghdad Battery is one of the most controversial and quietly disturbing artifacts ever associated with lost scientific knowledge, not because its function is definitively known, but because its existence challenges comfortable assumptions about the technological limits of the ancient world. Discovered in the 1930s near modern-day Baghdad, the object dates back roughly to the Parthian or early Sasanian period, around the 1st centuries BCE or CE. At first glance, it appeared unremarkable. A small clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod, sealed with bitumen. Only later did its potential significance become apparent. When examined closely, the structure of the object suggested intentional design rather than coincidence. The iron rod was isolated from the copper cylinder, preventing direct contact. The copper was carefully shaped and fitted inside the ceramic vessel. The bitumen seal acted as an insulator, protecting the contents from moisture and stabilizing the internal arrangement. When a mildly acidic liquid, such as vinegar or wine, was added to similar reconstructed devices, a small but measurable electrical current was produced. This discovery immediately raised uncomfortable questions. If the object functioned as a primitive battery, then electricity was being generated nearly 2,000 years before its supposed discovery in the modern era. Even at low voltage, this would imply a practical understanding of electrochemical reactions, whether consciously articulated or empirically exploited. The Baghdad Battery does not exist in isolation. Similar jars have been found in the region, suggesting the possibility of standardized production rather than a one-off experiment. This repetition implies purpose. Ancient craftsmen rarely invested labor into complex objects without clear utility. The question, then, is not whether the device could generate electricity but why. Several functional explanations have been proposed, none of them fully satisfying, yet none easily dismissed. One theory suggests the battery was used for electroplating, a process by which a thin layer of metal is deposited onto another surface using electrical current. Ancient artifacts from the region exhibit metal coatings of remarkable uniformity that are difficult to explain through purely mechanical methods. Electroplating would have provided a solution, allowing precious metals to be applied efficiently and consistently. Another theory points toward medical or ritual use. Low-voltage electrical stimulation produces sensations that ancient cultures might have interpreted as therapeutic or mystical. Electricity could have been associated with divine forces, healing practices, or ceremonial experiences. In this context, the battery would not have been understood scientifically, but experientially, as a controlled source of a strange and powerful effect. Critics argue that the Baghdad Battery may have served a more mundane purpose, such as storing scrolls or sacred objects. However, this explanation struggles to account for the internal metal components and their precise configuration. If storage were the goal, simpler designs would have sufficed. The complexity suggests intentional functionality. What makes the Baghdad Battery particularly unsettling is not just the possibility that it worked, but how easily such knowledge could vanish. If ancient artisans used electricity without formal theory, their understanding would have been procedural rather than conceptual. They would know what to build and how to use it without knowing why it worked. This kind of knowledge is extremely fragile. Once the tradition ends, there is nothing left to interpret the object correctly. The decline of the cultures that produced the Baghdad Battery likely sealed its fate. Political upheaval, shifting religious frameworks, and the loss of artisan guilds disrupted continuity. Without apprentices, workshops, or written explanations, the practice disappeared. The objects remained, but their purpose became opaque. Modern discomfort with the Baghdad Battery stems partly from its implications. It suggests that technological capability does not require modern scientific language. Practical results can precede theory by centuries or millennia. Electricity, often portrayed as a hallmark of modernity, may have existed on the margins of ancient experimentation, used sparingly, locally, and without institutional preservation. The Baghdad Battery does not prove that ancient civilizations had electrical grids or advanced machines. Its significance is more subtle and more disturbing. It suggests that humanity has repeatedly stumbled upon powerful principles, exploited them briefly, and then forgotten them entirely when social structures collapsed. Today, the artifact sits in museums and academic debates, stripped of its original context. It is discussed cautiously, often downplayed to avoid speculative conclusions. Yet its physical reality remains unchanged. The materials fit. The configuration works. The current flows. The Baghdad Battery stands as a symbol of lost experimental knowledge. It reminds us that science is not only lost in fires or conquests, but in silence, when practical traditions end without explanation. It represents a moment when humanity may have touched a fundamental force of nature, used it modestly, and then let it slip away, leaving behind an object that still quietly refuses to be explained away. Ending. Lost knowledge does not always disappear in flames or catastrophes. More often, it fades quietly, as people, traditions, and continuity vanish. The discoveries you've just heard about were real, functional, and in many cases ahead of their time. They remind us that scientific progress is fragile, and that humanity has already forgotten more than it remembers. If this story made you think, leave a like to support the channel. Subscribe if you want more calm, in-depth explorations of lost science and forgotten ideas. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which of these discoveries disturbed you the most, and why? And if you know someone who would appreciate this kind of story, share the video with them. Your curiosity keeps these stories alive.